We've mentioned reconnaissance a few times already in this series. Reconnaissance is information gathering. It's the first thing that attackers will do to learn about intended targets and whether or not they're vulnerable. But what happens after that? What happens next is scanning for vulnerabilities. Once we know who it is that we want to target and that we might have a number of servers up and running on a network, that will be the next step. Are they vulnerable? Are they running a web server stack? Are they running an FTP server? Are there components that are being used that haven't been patched? That's the kind of thing the vulnerability scans will result in. So when we do this, we have to think about the fact that we can compare this to existing scans. What that means is we can initially take a baseline scan of our network and the versions of all the software and everything that's running, and in the future we can compare current scans to that baseline to see what's changed. Is there anything new on the network? Or has anything been removed from the network? Because that could indicate a compromise. Now, compared to penetration testing, vulnerability scanning is considered passive. All we're doing is poking and probing to see what's vulnerable. If we find something vulnerable, we aren't trying to exploit it. If we were, then we would say that this is penetration testing, which is more active, where this is passive. So we want to make sure that we run these periodically, and you don't even have to do it manually. You can schedule periodic vulnerability scans. That's going to differ a little bit exactly how you do it depending on the product you're using to conduct vulnerability scans, and there are plenty of them. We're going to be looking at one shortly called LandGuard, but there are other vulnerability scanners like OpenVAS, Nessus, to name just a few. Now, the other thing about this is that we have to decide what it is that we're going to scan for vulnerabilities. Do we want to scan everything that appears to be up and running on a network? On a large network, it could take a while to run a vulnerability scan. But if that is your network, it's absolutely necessary that that be done, as we just said, periodically, not just once. Or you might focus a vulnerability scan against a particular host, maybe an application server. Or to get even more specific, you could scan an individual application for vulnerabilities. We saw an example when we used OWASP ZAP, the Z-Attack proxy tool, to scan a specific web app for common vulnerabilities. So vulnerability scanning then comes in a couple of forms. We can run a credentialed scan. Now, running a credentialed scan means that you are providing the vulnerability scanning tool with credentials that would be required to authenticate to devices out on the network, like servers, smartphones, laptops, network switches, routers. Now, of course, all of those devices will have different sets of credentials, won't they? So if you're a network admin, you probably know a lot of those credentials. You can enter in more than one set. The idea is that when the vulnerability scan occurs, it's able to go into the devices and really do a thorough check to see that everything is secure. However, we also sometimes want to run uncredentialed scans because we kind of want to mimic what it would be like for someone that doesn't have access to these devices. What would they see as being vulnerable? So you really should consider running both credentialed and non-credentialed scans periodically, not just once. When you use a vulnerability scanning tool like LandGuard or Nessus or OpenVAS, what happens is that tool has a vulnerability database that it draws upon and it checks for when it's scanning the hosts on your network. As you might guess, there are new vulnerabilities discovered every day, which means that that scanning database in your tool needs to be kept up to date. So that means before you run a scan, whether it's scheduled or whether you manually do it, you need to make sure that the vulnerability database is up to date. Now, by doing this, it can also help reduce false negatives. A false negative means that the vulnerability scanner says, hey, this server is safe. There's no security vulnerabilities. But that might be because your database is out of date, and so your tool doesn't know that there's a newly discovered vulnerability that could be very serious. So update that database. So let's take a minute now and let's look at an existing scan that I've taken on a fictitious network, a sample test network in the past. So I'm using a trial version of an old tool called GFI LandGuard. Now I say an old tool because I have the 2014 edition. There are newer editions, but they look and feel very, very similar. The first thing I want to point out is keeping that database up to date. If I were to go, let's say, to the configuration menu here, One of the options I have in this tool is to select database maintenance options. So we can configure how we want the database to be kept up to date, program updates. I can click on that as well. And we might have a list of all kinds of new patches that need to be applied here. But really, essentially, it's new things that it will scan for when you do a vulnerability assessment. Now, I've already opened up an existing scan that I've saved. So if I click on Dashboard, I get some great visualizations. You know how they say a picture says 1,000 words? That's kind of what we're getting here. I'm guessing that when I see a lot of red and when I see high vulnerabilities, a lot of them, immediately that's a problem. And we can learn that just by quickly glancing at this. So we have a lot of problem with missing software updates, as evidenced by what we're seeing in the dashboard. A lot of vulnerabilities. And we can see that we have a lot of high vulnerabilities. They're all prioritized. We've got a pie chart where the lion's share of that pie chart is red, which matched to the legend means high vulnerabilities, high risk. Now, I can also click the Scan tab up at the top, and on the left, it's kind of like using Nmap, or more specifically, the front-end GUI that we looked at called ZenMap. But remember, Nmap is not a vulnerability scanner. It's a network scanner. It tells you what's up and running and what services are running on hosts. That's it. This is telling us a lot more. Technically, Nmap can do a bit more, like OS fingerprinting, but it doesn't do anything to the extent that a true vulnerability assessment tool like this does. So let's say I were to expand the details on a computer that was discovered on the network. I can then drill down on the left under vulnerabilities. Here we've got high security vulnerabilities. That's shown under vulnerability assessment. Over on the right, it tells me what they are. Auto run is enabled on this host. Auto run, doesn't that mean if I put in a CD, a DVD, plug in a thumb drive, something like that, it automatically can execute something on that device? It does. What a great way to infect computers with malware. So we have a listing of a lot of those vulnerabilities. There are medium security vulnerabilities. And as we move on through what was discovered, for example, here I have an Apple iOS device that was discovered on the network. I can scroll down and see what it found. In this case, it has much less information. It's really telling me that I've got a couple of open ports. Also, as we scroll down, we might even have other devices. I've got a network printer shown here, an HP device, so I can drill down and see, does it have any vulnerabilities? It's not just looking at Windows and Linux systems, it's also infrastructure equipment and also printers and IoT devices. All of those things need to be accounted for. So here I only have a low security vulnerability related to that network printer. Really, it's talking here about the fact that that network printer is running an embedded web server. That's normal. However, how we configure it is important. You need to harden printers, because if you don't change the default admin credentials used to connect to the built-in web server to manage that printer, it could be susceptible to attack. But the beauty is that when we run a vulnerability assessment, we don't have to go figuring that out. We run a scan, it very clearly will tell us where we need to focus our energy. For the Security Plus exam, you might be presented with questions that are scenario-based, where one of the requirements that must be met in the correct answer is that we need a way to discover vulnerabilities without actively exploiting them. The answer, of course, would be a vulnerability assessment, because running a penetration test does attempt to actively exploit those vulnerabilities.